Hey guys, Johnny from Ignite here. Thanks for tuning in to another video. Today we're going to be looking at how to incorporate contextual elements of Shakespeare's The Tempest into your essay alongside quotes that actually relate explicitly to those contextual elements. But before we get into the video, please make sure you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Click the bell so you are notified whenever we have new videos released for you, and make sure you check out our website at ignitehsc.com.au where we have all of our best and most practical comprehensive resources for HSC English and a bunch of other subjects that you might be studying. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so when we're looking at Module A textual conversations, the first thing you need to realize is how important context is. That is, you need to appreciate and demonstrate to a marker throughout your essay that you understand the importance of the contextual elements and influences that actually shape both The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's Hag-Seed. So today I'm going to be focusing on the context of The Tempest, and it's important that you realize that when we talk about context in relation to both of these texts, we're trying to establish dissonances between the time periods of those two texts. Contextual dissonances. You might recognize that word dissonances from the rubric, which basically just means a difference in very simple language, or a conflict or disagreement. So there might be a disagreement between Shakespeare and Atwood in terms of the textual conversation they're having when they're actually going over the plot of their respective stories. We know that the stories in The Tempest and Hag-Seed are very similar, but there are notable differences. And when you spot a difference, the thing you want to do straight away in your essay, and you want to tie this into the sentence, is actually to attribute those differences to a particular element of the relevant composer's context. So the tricky thing here is, and this is the thing that not a lot of students are doing, is actually to make sure that when you bring in context, you can link it to a relevant quote from the text. A lot of people just refer to context generally, but they're not referring to a specific contextual element that actually relates to an extract from the text, which also must be analyzed, of course. You want to pull a technique and you want to focus on form while you're doing this. So there's a lot to do really in each sentence. Sentence or two, you could unpack it in two sentences within a body paragraph. But a lot of students aren't actually being specific when they're talking about context because they're not actually looking at particular quotes from the text that could link to a specific contextual element, because that's quite tricky to do. But that's what I'm going to show you here. I'm going to show you some examples of quotes and how you can link context in. The last thing I want to mention in this little preamble is how important it is to do this frequently. So two issues that I notice with students when it comes to incorporating context into their Mod A essays: it's not being specific enough when you actually refer to a contextual element, and it's not doing it frequently enough. So specificity and frequency. You want to make sure that you're incorporating specific contextual elements at least twice per body paragraph. That's how important context is for this module. It needs to be clear that you understand why the values in each text, the values espoused by each text, are different. And that's because the time periods that these texts were respectively created are different. They're separated by 400 years. So let's rewind to the Jacobean era, that is Shakespeare's context. Let's go back to 1610, 1611, when this play was written and first published, and let's revisit those contextual elements in relation to the quotes in the actual text. So, what are the key contextual elements of Shakespeare's context? Let's go through four, and I'm going to show you a quote, or at least one quote, that relates to each one. The first one is to note that it is produced, or it is a product of, the Jacobean era. So that is when King James of Scotland was now the King of England after Queen Elizabeth died. And just note that Queen Elizabeth, after she died in the 17th century, so early 1600s, when that change of monarch occurred from Queen Elizabeth to King James, the reason we have King James of Scotland, we don't have an English king, is because Queen Elizabeth did not have an heir. So that's very important because people were very anxious at the time about who would control their country. They didn't know if they would have a leader. So there was a lot of anxiety about this situation whereby the queen may die and then there would be no heir to fill it. So we have all these people from other countries come in and try and compete for the crown, as that was what happened in those days. So King James of Scotland comes in. He is now the ruler. And I know it doesn't sound right, but King James translates to Jacobean. I know that would seem like it would be King Jacob, but it's Jacobean era based on the fact that King James was the ruler of England at this time. So the Jacobean era encompasses a lot of values, and we're going to go through a few. We want to think about the supernatural. They believed in the supernatural at this time. It was a heavily Protestant country, not Catholic. Note that not Catholic. The Catholics were more underground. There was a conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. Always struggle to say that word. But basically, Protestantism was the predominant Christian denomination at the time. And at that time, within that religious orthodoxy, was a belief in the supernatural. And they also believed in the great chain of being. Make sure you write these terms down if you haven't already. So the great chain of being was a social hierarchy in this time period, which said that God was at the top, the king or queen was next, then the heir, and then the nobles, all the way down to the commoners, and then all the way down to rocks. So there was a natural hierarchy, and it was important that that hierarchy remained in check. If for any reason there was a disruption to the hierarchy, for instance, the king or queen was killed unlawfully and then someone else took over who shouldn't be, there's a disrupted great chain of being, and that would result in supernatural intervention until the natural order was corrected. So keep that in mind for when we look at one of our quotes. Another thing to focus on is that we had a very patriarchal value system. Patriarchal means male-dominated, right? It was very much in favor of the male, of the masculine form. And you can see that in the way that women were treated there. They didn't have the same power. They didn't have the same roles as men. So there wasn't that equality that you see more and more of today, right? Because in light of feminism and the movement towards equality of opportunity between all sexes. Well, it was more and more patriarchal as we go back in time. So when we're in Shakespeare's time, women were certainly treated differently. And there was this idea of having to always control the female if you were the male. So we'll see how that comes out in the text as well. So these are specific terms, patriarchal value system. We're going to link that to an actual quote from the play. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is that we have the age of discovery happening. This is where there is rapid colonization over the world. A lot of the British Empire was going over to America, for instance, doing like a double one there, America, for instance, and they're trying to colonize. They're trying to spread their influence. So what does that mean? It means that when they're colonizing, when they're discovering new land, they're discovering a lot of natives on the lands that they are going to. And there were conflicting perspectives at the time about this. So people thought that the natives, well, at least from the Western point of view, they thought they were savages. They didn't have any respect for them, and they thought they deserved to be killed upon colonization. That they were horrible forms of humans. So they were less human, they were subhuman, if you like. That was one perspective. But there was another perspective that came out around this time, and you'll see this in someone's essay, and I'm going to say to someone right now, write this down. Michel, so M-I-C-H-E-L, de Montaigne is the name of the author here, and the essay is called Of Cannibals. Of Cannibals. So write that down in speech marks there. And you can research this yourself. But that essay basically stipulated that the Western attitudes were wrong. And it reversed those egocentric values, those egocentric Western perspectives that believed in the superiority of Western culture. It actually reversed that. It challenged that. So that's important because it was suggesting that the natives were actually the more pure form of humans, not the subhumans. So we have different perspectives come out here that actually portray the Westerners and the natives differently. And you're going to see this ambivalence, this tension, the fact we're undecided of how we should treat natives. You're going to see that ambivalence, that's a key word, projected throughout the play. Shakespeare is acknowledging these tensions in perspectives at the time. Okay, a third key factor, and remember I was grouping the supernatural and the great chain of being under Jacobean era there, as well as the patriarchal values. So that was one. Then we have age of discovery. The third key value, okay, and I think I've got a thing here for you. The third key value is the Renaissance. The the Renaissance was occurring. And this was a period of significant self-discovery for a lot of people, of revisiting some classical values, but also discovering the transformative potential of the human, how much humans themselves are malleable. That means they can change in their identity. So this period of the Renaissance was very much focused on discovering new things about the world, but also about oneself. Okay, so how can someone's identity change over time? Let's look at that malleability, that transformative potential. They're key values that come out of the Renaissance. So make sure that in your essay, you're not just saying the Renaissance, you're actually saying the malleability or the transformative potential of the individual. We want to talk about the potential of mankind. It was a very optimistic time in that respect. It was about what the human could become, what man could be. And then lastly, a personal contextual aspect, right? Remember, these are more historical. What about personal context? That's to do with the author, the composer. It was Shakespeare's last solo-authored play. And you might not know that, but actually after The Tempest, the only plays he was involved in were actually co-written, often with someone called John Fletcher, which is ironic because in Hag-Seed, in Atwood's novel, the prison, the correctional center is actually called the Fletcher Correctional Center, implying that Atwood, very much like John Fletcher, is a collaborator with Shakespeare despite his retirement from solo-authored plays. So rewind that and try and think about that, because that's quite a cool idea that you could explore in your essays. But it's Shakespeare's last solo-authored play, and that's why the play is so meta-theatrical. He's acknowledging the performative aspect of everything, of life, that life itself is like a play. That's why you see plays within the play. And he actually steps out of the play at the end, you might remember, in the epilogue, and he actually speaks directly to the audience. So he's breaking the fourth wall. He is talking directly to the audience, having that direct engagement, and actually asking them to applaud. He's asking them to applaud him because it's out of his control now. So much like Prospero has to relinquish control in the play, he has to relinquish control of Miranda, he has to relinquish control of his magic, he has to give up those powers and just let life play out as it will, rather than imposing his will on everything, on the natural order. He actually has to let that go. Shakespeare also has to let that control go. He can't control the audience's response. So because he's retiring, he says, please farewell me. I no longer have the power, you have the power. So you can see the connection there with that context. All right, I know I've talked a lot already and alluded to a lot of scenes in the play that relate to these, but let me quickly show you some quotes that could be really useful for your essay. Because again, you want to use these specific values that we've talked about here. Oh, one last one, of course, is the feudal system, the fact that they valued revenge a lot. This is a time where you had kings and queens, you have that monarchy. We don't really value these things as much anymore. I think we would all agree, unless you're a very vengeful person, we don't really value revenge in the same way. You know, if someone has killed a family member, you do see people avenge their family, I suppose, but it's not given, it's not granted that if someone you love dies because of someone else that you have to kill them, that actually that's the moral imperative, that's the right thing to do, you have to kill that person. We don't think that way, or at least I don't anymore. So no more feudal values when we move to hag-seed's time, but there is feudalism. That system is in place in this period within the Jacobean era. So we've basically covered all of this, which is great. So let's move on to the quote. So which values apply here? Here's a quote right at the start of the play. What cares these warriors for the name of king? That's said by the boatswain. So if you need context for this, remember when all the nobles are on a boat, they're on a ship, and Prospero's on this stranded island. He's been exiled and he's really resentful towards all of these nobles because they actually were the ones who exiled him in the first place. So they're on this ship, he sees the ship and he uses his magic to summon this illusory tempest, this storm, to bring them to the island so that he can get his revenge. Now, once that tempest, that storm is in place, what the boatswain says, what cares these warriors for the name of king? He's actually almost committing treason here, right? They would say that's blasphemy. You can't speak about the king like that, our royal king. You can't say that the storm doesn't care about the king. But what this is alluding to, and maybe you can think back quickly to the list of values we talked about, is how the political hierarchy or the social hierarchy here, because the boatswain's speaking out of turn or is speaking in a bad way about the king, it's demonstrating this inversion of social hierarchy, reflecting a disrupted great chain of being. The great chain of being is the specific contextual element there, and this inversion of hierarchy, which is basically brought on through the metaphor of shipwreck. It's a metaphor because it is a figurative performance. The metaphor of shipwreck here, the way the boatswain questions the king's power against nature, that inversion relates to a disrupted great chain of being. Okay, there's also an interesting one here where we have Miranda, who has just heard from Prospero that there is more about his life that she doesn't know. She says, more to know, did never meddle with my thoughts. Because she doesn't want these people to be hurt. She doesn't know what's going on. She's confused that these random people who she's never seen, Miranda's been on the island basically her whole life. She was only 3 years old or something like that when they got exiled. She's been there her whole life. She doesn't know about all these other people. And she sees them come in and she's scared for them naturally. She has that innocence and also that benevolence, that kindness, that kind heart. And then Prospero is saying, no, there's a reason I'm doing this. You don't understand, you don't know everything about me. And she's saying, more to know, did never meddle with my thoughts. So we see this idea of more to know, did never meddle, right? So we've got this kind of alliteration going on. You can see more to know, did never meddle, so that those M's there, and even the N also is playing into that, in emphasizing the extent of patriarchal control over Miranda. Notice how I'm saying patriarchal control, because clearly she didn't know any better. She doesn't know a lot. So this is alluding to the fact that Prospero, because he's the male, has a lot more knowledge, and he actually has the power, this is the more important point, he has the power to actually suppress Miranda's knowledge. So this is reflective of a sense of patriarchal control at the time of what women could know, trying to preserve their innocence, but also their ignorance. Okay, great. So that's another contextual element there. What about the Renaissance? We've talked about how that's about human potential, what mankind is capable of, being malleable, transforming in one's identity. Well, Prospero actually in Act 5, Scene 1, if you're moving towards the second half of your essay, you could talk about this quote, the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. So he's actually realizing that being virtuous is more important than revenge. He doesn't think that at the start. That's why he summoned the Tempest. He wanted to exact revenge. So again, alliteration here, you wouldn't use this in the same paragraph with the same techniques, of course, but I've just plucked some random ones that are very clear examples of how you could use specific contextual elements. But yes, there is the V's here, there is that alliteration, which places emphasis on these two words, and it is emphasizing a transformation in his values because he no longer values vengeance as much as virtue. So you could say there has been a reconfiguration, and it's a Renaissance-inspired transformation or reconfiguration of values. So the important thing is, if you talk about this, to link it to the Renaissance and the values of the Renaissance that emphasize transformation, personal discovery. Okay, so we can see here that he's transforming in a Renaissance kind of way. That's what the Renaissance were really emphasizing, people being able to transform and discover new identities in themselves. And clearly this is showing that because he's now realizing he has to forgive. It's more important to forgive those people who betrayed him than to hold a vendetta against them, to exact revenge. It's not important. That becomes secondary. Or rather, it becomes redundant or futile. It's actually not going to be productive for him to be vengeful anymore. So that's a significant aspect of transformation that can be linked to the Renaissance. What about the Age of Discovery? Well, I mentioned this essay, there's the spelling for you if you didn't get it down, of Cannibals. And a post-colonial reading, by the way, so a reading here means interpretation. An interpretation by someone who is looking back at all, the disastrous events that often were encompassed by colonization. So when people would colonize, there would often be massacres, and we all know this from studying Australian history and other histories as well, that there would often be a massacre of the natives, there was a complete incompatibility there and a distrust, a disrespect. So a post-colonial reading looking back who thinks all of that was very unfair and very savage of the colonizers, the people who were going there, which was often the Westerners, was Caliban protesting against the colonizer. They would see Caliban as having a legitimate ground in protesting Prospero, even though Caliban is depicted often as a monster. So he's depicted as a monster, as looking like a half man, half fish kind of character. But actually, we see with the way he talks, and you can see that here, and this should be a capital S, I believe, The isle is full of noises. This means the island. Look at the way he talks. The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. He's speaking so eloquently, the eloquence of his language. The fact he actually speaks occasionally in verse, iambic blank verse is what he's speaking in. So there's a rhythm to the way he's talking, and he's speaking in verse in the sense that if you were to see a lot of his lines in the play, when he speaks so eloquently, so beautifully of the island, it's actually got the capitals at the start of the lines there when you notice that. But he doesn't always talk like that, and lower status characters typically never do speak in verse with that structured sense of speech, because that's more sophisticated. It suggests they are higher up in the value and in the hierarchy. It suggests that they are higher up in the value system of society, in the hierarchy there. So if you speak in prose, which is the opposite, that's just like conversational language. You wouldn't use a slash when you're quoting, and you also, remember that's supposed to be a capital, you wouldn't see capitals at the start of every line with which they speak. So that's a key distinction to notice. He is being given this more supreme form of language. He's speaking in this supreme form of verse and iambic blank verse because it's not actually rhyming, but there is a rhythm to it. And that suggests that he actually has this more pure appreciation of nature, that he's more in tune with nature. So that alludes to what Michel de Montaigne's essay of Cannibals was saying, and that's the link you want to make there, which actually contradicts the Western perception of natives as savages, which would be suggested by the epithets often used to describe Caliban. Epithets is the technique there, to describe Caliban as a monster or a fish, or one of those quotes that you can find in the actual play. Okay, what about it being Shakespeare's final solo play? This is the last one for the Tempest. Another useful quote that you can try and incorporate. Remember, you want about 2 quotes with contextual links in each paragraph, and you're probably going to have 2 paragraphs on the Tempest as your primary focus. You'll still make links to hag-seed when you can, especially in the last 3 out of the 4 body paragraphs. And then you're going to have 2 bodies on hag-seed where you'll also want 2 contextual links there, like I'm showing you here. So I've shown you 4 here, so that should set you up nicely. Here we say, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hand. So this is at the end when he's broken the 4th wall. There's the technique. It's in the epilogue, so you're acknowledging the function of that form there. And it's meta-theatrical because he's actually stepping out of the play. And he's still in the play, but now he's divorced from the play that just was. So he stepped out and said, okay, you need a clap for me now. This is a rhyming couplet as well. So a ton of techniques there for you to do with this. You don't have to use all of them. But the point is he's stepping out and acknowledging that it's in the audience's hands to applaud and to let him go and retire. So he's acknowledging the end of his career there. You can talk about that personal context and you can use some of those techniques as well. So remember, he's relinquishing control from theatre, just like Prospero in the previous scene had to relinquish his magic and control, patriarchal control over Miranda. And he had that Renaissance-inspired transformation. Okay, awesome. I hope that helps you guys. I know that was quite in depth. I hope it really does give you the specifics of how you can use a quote, link it to a contextual element. Don't forget to also reference form when you can, even if it means replacing a more specific technique such as alliteration. Always prioritize form. So, for example, talking about breaking the 4th wall and the meta-theatricality of the play, talk about those things above the specific techniques, but pair them together if you can. I hope that helps. Remember how important context is. That's going to be a big distinguisher. Be specific and be frequent. We'll see you in the next video. Make sure you like, comment below, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed, click that bell, and check out ignitehsc.com.au for our most comprehensive resources on the Tempest and hag-seed. All of this in written form, essay usable form, tons of exemplar materials there, and tons more for all your other subjects. See you in the next video.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. If you do like the content, subscribe to our channel and we'll have more videos coming your way.
That's right, guys. Thanks for watching. And please make sure you check out our online resource database. We've had a team of state rank achievers and heads of English put these together for you, covering everything from essay structures and examples all the way through to craft of writing and comprehension skills. So check them out at ignitehsc.com.au and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.